Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink and Counterweight podcast with my co-host, David Bernstein. Today, we have Wei Hua Chin and George Lee with us. Wei Hua is the founder and president of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, Greater New York. George is also a part of that organization. And just today, actually, George was on a call with David, an earlier live stream on anti-Semitism and Jewish-Asian relations. So maybe we'll hear a little bit about that. But before we get started, did anyone bring anything to the table to drink? Wei Hua, you? Tea or
nice
coffee?
Christmassy. It's actually tea. Thank you.
Oh, okay. George, anything for you?
Oh, I've been wanting to get a cup of coffee since lunch. And I'll get one after this.
And David, did I hear you say, I love it when you bring Fireball whiskey to the table?
Yeah, Fireball whiskey. It's delicious. What can I tell you?
That's very holiday-ish. I'm boring in that I just have wine, but like you, Wei Hua, I have a glass that says Santa define nice. So I think your glass is almost as important as your drink sometimes. Okay, so before we get started, I've got to tell you a little bit. I don't know, Wei Hua and George, if you know this about me, but I grew up in Asia. I grew up mainly in Southeast Asia. And then when I went to school, I studied Chinese and I lived and worked in China, in several places in Nanjing and Shanghai, Beijing. And so a lot of my network are not just Chinese Americans, Chinese. And one of the things that I did, among many things I did in China, was deal with Chinese who wanted to come over to the United States for education. So helping with that, the educational passports and J1s, visas, and all that kind of stuff. That was one of the things. And, it was crazy because I've got two things that I kind of want to get out there. The first is that years ago, I would say maybe a decade even, people were scrambling from all over the world, not just China, but that was my expertise with China, to get visas because they wanted to come to the United States for education. And over the past couple of years, not at all. India's dried up, China's dried up. And there's other reasons. There's internal reasons to the reasons why. There's the global reasons like economy and whatnot. But I have heard several people say, they're just not really interested in the American education system. Like some of the troubles that they've been seeing lately, they're just kind of like, it's not what it used to be. It's not what we used to come over for. That's the first thing. And I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But the other thing that's really an interesting change for me, having done this work and been, living and working in China since the 90s, is that you wrote this in your piece for City Journal, Wei Hua. You wrote this, and I thought it was really interesting. To me, it really was the issue of meritocracy that brought, in particular, Chinese Americans out and kind of politicize them, if you will. And you even mentioned this, and maybe that's where we start in your piece, that was an issue that, for the most part, I think Chinese Americans were somewhat apolitical in some ways. I mean, again, I'm stereotyping that as a generalization, but you really saw, and you wrote on this, you saw this around education. And could you speak a little bit on why you felt that had some sort of cohesion in the Asian American community?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to be on your program. This is a good chance for us to really enlarge the thinking of what really concerns us in our relations, as well as our concept of merit. What are the basic principles that we're working on right now? Merit is a key item here. As most people know, there are Asians who are very, very concerned about education. We believe in it. We think that it's a good thing for not just us, but for everybody. And it's not really a one culture versus another culture. We know that there are certain cultures who may prize it more, but we do believe that it is good for everybody. And so we start off on that premise and say that there is something called basic good education. And people did come from around the world thinking that this is a place where you can study, not for ideology, but for the basic facts and figures and information, to learn what logic means, to learn what reasoning means, and be able to discuss this openly. And we don't have that kind of environment in the same way that we had just several years ago. It used to be that people were coming out from China or Russia. They would come out and be able to say all these things and not be afraid. And now all of a sudden, everybody's walking on eggshells because they're afraid that they may say something that will cause them to be canceled. That is not American. That is not really something that can increase and enhance our ability to be educated and rational people. You have to have that kind of discourse to be able to debate, to discuss facts. If there are facts that you don't like, they're still facts, and you must address them. And so when you get to the point that it is not as important to go and discuss what is a 1 + 1 = 2 and say that, well, that doesn't count now. That doesn't matter. We have to have math appreciation because not everybody can do math as well. That means that you have to take seats away from certain people who are really engaged in that kind of study. That's not good. And we saw that happening. That was something that we saw in education first, where they were trying to take away seats from Asians, not because they became suddenly dumber or lazier, but just because they were Asian, and they did not really address the question of what is education for. It is for teaching people everywhere. And that's something we have to get back to.
In your piece, you mentioned too, and I thought this was really interesting. You mentioned, Russians and Chinese in particular in coming together in the New York area. And I thought that, we've talked a lot to a lot of Russian immigrants around this issue. I know David has as well. And what they're seeing and the comparisons that they're making to what they saw, back home is really rather shocking too. So I think that for me in particular, hearing the voices coming out of places like Russia and China, more so than say maybe a place like India, is more of a, what's the word I want to use? An alert, to me that there's something wrong when people are making comparisons to those systems.
Well, it is a shock for a lot of the immigrants coming over here. They're used to doing things in math at 3rd grade, and all of a sudden they see it being taught in the 8th grade curriculum. And that's crazy. It shouldn't be that way. They see their kids falling behind. And so when a lot of these groups, these immigrant groups, have classes outside, it's not just for privilege or something like that. That narrative is all wrong. It is really trying to complement and really take care of some of the deficiencies in the public education system, that parents would say, I'm going to take some of my hard-earned money, it is a sacrifice, and put it into some programs after school on weekends so that their kids would have that chance to be catching up to hopefully the rest of the world. We are falling behind in America, and we do need people to focus on how to keep our standards high.
So, we're at this current ideological moment. There's this idea of meritocracy. Is that the main concern that you see among Chinese American leaders, and maybe other, if you want to expand it, other or Asian Americans or other immigrants? Is the meritocracy ideal being challenged? Is it this the idea that maybe you'll be targeted by people in this sort of racial equity sweep where you'll be blamed for oppression? I mean, where do you think the main trigger points are for Asian Americans, Chinese Americans, especially as they operate in this current environment?
Well, unquestionably, there's a matter of targeting that is beyond even merit. But I think that merit is part of it. So you could say that we're going to get rid of merit because we want to prize, first of all, racial dynamics. We're going to do the racial spoils thing. And so that means that somebody's going to get targeted. And it's not based on merit or reason. but it's based on basically a kind of different dynamics, talking about the oppressors and victims. Those are names that are coming up, titles that in terms that are really hurting people's ability to talk to one another. If you start off by saying that somebody is born an oppressor or born a victim, if that sort of stops the conversation right there. Where is the individual in this case? Where is the ability for people to say that we can determine our lives and to improve it for ourselves and everybody else around us? But if you fall into that trap of saying that everybody's divided into these two camps, I would say, first of all, to divide people into these camps like that, that's psychological abuse. If you looked at anybody and said that, well, if you went to study people and they said that, well, before I even decide and listen to you, I've already determined that you're an oppressor, you're going to be put in one camp, and I've looked at you and said, okay, I don't need to know anything about you, I put you into the victim camp. You start having the psychoses going on. We have this mass psychoses going on, which is very abusive to everybody. When you have the Asians, I've heard this directly from people that Asian parents who have sent their kids to school, and then after a while they've noticed that their kids are coming back changed, and they're much quieter. They're much more scared to talk because all of a sudden they are considered to be in that category of being potentially either oppressor or victim, neither of which is good. And so when you're a thinking person and you have to say, where do I fit in this world? And you have to think of yourselves in those terms. You cannot really do the best for yourself or for your community around you. So the kind of impact that you have starting from the schools, when you have schools that will say, well, we're going to exclude you because of your race. That's saying you don't belong here. That's exactly the same kind of thing that's being said on the streets. If your schools themselves tell the kids, you don't belong here, not because of what you yourself did, but because of what you look like, that's the exact thing that we see now on the streets when you have thugs coming up to people and say, you don't belong here, and you slug them. So how is that different? It is the same. One is more physical and the other is more psychological or mental, but it is the same message that's coming through that is extremely harmful to both the people who are committing this kinds of crimes, and there are crimes in both sides. This is the kind of Asian hate. When you talk about hate, it's Asian hate in the schools by this kind of exclusion. It's a modern Chinese exclusion act, and it's the same kind of hate right on the streets. This is not the time for the kind of sitting back to stop and accept it. I think this is the time to stand up and say that we don't accept this.
Mm. So, one of the ideas that's gotten a lot of play, and it is this idea of the model minority myth. And I'm sure you're familiar with this. I'll just do my best to define it. It's the idea that certain minorities in this country constitute a model minority that other minorities should look up to and replicate. But it's used to actually, the idea of it being a myth is A, it's not true, and B, it's used to try to shut that down so that there's no discussion about various cultures and how they operate on the American scene. It's a way of saying it is illegitimate to talk about Asian culture and how it creates success. You call it a myth, and you say it's a form of racism. It's an easy way to shut down the whole discussion around it. How much have you thought about that, dealt with it, and how popular I've heard a lot. I have to tell you, I've heard a lot of Chinese Americans and Asian American organizations talk about this and try to stop people from using it. And I've seen various Asian American organizations put on seminars and workshops on how not to use the model minority myth. So how do you regard the whole thing?
Personally, I think that we're wasting a lot of time on a term that doesn't mean a ton. I think that when you say something like a model minority, sure, there are people who like to stereotype, I thought we were beyond stereotyping. So let's start off on that. But I do think that if you want to talk about specific traits and characteristics that help people try to achieve in this society, we can discuss that. And it does go across different cultures. So if we look at some of the aspects, some of the values that really will help any culture and say, okay, we have sacrifice. We talked about a little bit earlier. That's one point. I think that there have been studies about little kids, and those who know how to defer gratification tend to do better in life. That is something that is a studied, researched, a kind of response for even children, and they track them over the years and see how you do. And if that is part of it, is that something that is just Asian, or did not many cultures do that? And if that is something that other cultures did, why are we trying to say it's only the Asians did it, which is not true? I mean, it's nice that the Asians happen to be doing it perhaps a little bit more now, because they are a large immigrant population right now in the U.S. And typically immigrants coming in know that they must sacrifice. You know that you come in thinking that you may have to sacrifice so that the next generation does better. That is part of it. That is part of everybody coming in to know that it is not so easy to give up whatever you had in another country, but you usually do not come from another country except that you think that this country will provide better opportunities. Our ancestors, your ancestors, did not come here because they thought that they would torture their future descendants. They thought that coming to America would improve their lives. So I think that that's something for us to think about, that kind of thinking of a long term. What are the things that we want to do? We want to prize education. We want to focus on the work ethic, which is not a white Protestant work ethic. I remember the first time when I heard that somebody was accusing it of being a white work ethic, and I said, what was that? The work ethic belongs to everybody. We can all partake in this. We can also think about the family structure. It is true that immigrant families tend to be much more focused on the family. They're more traditional structures. And that is something that people like to say, well, we don't want to talk about values. Well, it is about values. We should not be ashamed of values. Let's have a good conversation about it.
I think that you made a really important distinction there. It's not because Asian Americans, Chinese Americans in particular, are a very large immigrant group, but it really is, it is in some ways an attribute of many immigrants to work hard, study hard. I mean, they didn't come, they came to better their lives. So there is that ethos, if you will. But you said something in your article that made me laugh, that, I'm not going to apologize for studying. I mean, I shouldn't have to say sorry, shouldn't have to apologize for studying. I really like that. And that made me think of something that Kenny Xu was talking to us, about the whole, in his book, Inconvenient Minority. And he said something that was really interesting to me. He said, you can to a certain extent choose culture, right? I mean, like studying, you can choose that as if you want to adopt that as part of your culture, as part of who you are, that's a choice. So there's a lot in culture that is actually, we have some determination over. And so to ascribe studying hard only to Asian cultures is really, that's kind of ridiculous, I mean, it's a choice.
Agreed. Anybody can study. And we have to, and we have a lot of people apologizing for studying. We had people who would regret and say that, gee, I have my kids studying and you're a little bit ashamed of it. And I'm thinking, why are you ashamed of doing something good? You shouldn't boast of it. You shouldn't walk out and say, hey, I studied 20 hours today. That's not what we're supposed to be doing. But I think that to be able to say that I'm not ashamed and you have to hide it. Unfortunately, a lot of people do say that, well, the Asians, they're just study robots, they're test robots. That's not true. If you look at what has happened, and I know that Kenny, as well as many other people have talked about it, that the Asians, if you look at the applicants to college, they have tremendous extracurriculars. They have a lot of the same things that you would look for anywhere. It's not just that they do well in the academic scores, but these are full human beings. They can do the same kind of things in working in your, not just your laboratory competitions and robotics teams, but they are kids who are playing instruments and doing very well in playing the instruments. It's not just like a once a week type of thing. They will be in athletic teams, they will be dancing, they will be singing, they will be doing the arts. These are not sort of one-dimensional people, but to be able to lump them in that kind of way, to call them one-dimensional, to just strike them off as being a model minority, that's absolutely a stereotype that doesn't really do people any good. It's okay to have certain attributes that you say, well, that's a good thing to have, to talk about some of the values that we've discussed over here. But to just say, well, it's just because they're Asian, so we don't have to care about those values. No, it should be the other way around. It should be that we care about these values. And because the Asians are having it, let's go and replicate those for any culture. On the aside, for when we're talking about model minorities, I think that we have to remember that Asians are extremely diverse. And when you're talking about a population that is globally nearly half of humanity, with countries that have been very long, cultures that are long, religions, languages, all very different, to lump them all as one monolithic group is actually absurd. It shows a lack of understanding.
Mm-hmm. Well, if we're going to do that, then there are actually 3 Asians on this podcast right now, and 1 Asian wannabe. I'm 50. I'm 50.4% Western Asian. My mom is from Baghdad, Iraq, according to 23andMe. So I'm a majority Asian. My Chinese wife does not think I qualify, but that's another. We have this argument all the time. But it strikes me as strange sometimes that we're creating all these affinity groups as if Asians all have the same experience. It's a kind of stereotyping, really, if anything, that that we're doing. What does a Chinese in what way does a Chinese person have more in common with a fellow Asian Iranian than they do a Russian? And I think it sort of contrives a certain affinity, ethnic affinity, that probably doesn't exist and makes no sense. But that's what happens when you start forcing everybody down these sort of identity categories. George, what do you think about all this?
We will cover a wide range of subjects, but I think you're right. The Chinese, and Jennifer, you might recognize this. They have a notion of 君子 and 小人. 君子 is usually translated as a man of virtue, and 小人 is literally a small person, a little person. But I think what I want to focus on is the smallness of mind. And I think this balkanization, this division of pitting one group into smaller and smaller identities, are literally making us into smaller and smaller human beings. Wewa said earlier, we do not apologize for education. I'll go a little further. We should not apologize for civilization. Civilization is not pretty. But Western civilization is a real wonder. It's an amazing thing, starting from Judeo-Christian tradition, the Greeks, the Renaissance, the Italians, and all that belongs to everyone. And if you want to make your mind big, grand, you want to embrace all of that, which is why Glenn Lowry, in one of his speeches, said something that really struck it home. He said, Tolstoy belongs to me. Dickens belongs to me.
Yes.
Newton belongs to me. Maxwell belongs to me, and Einstein belongs to me. And I think the same way. That is how we attain humanity fully, rather than make us smaller and smaller and smaller.
Yeah.
Right. So what about this notion of cultural
I
appropriation?
knew you were going to
becomes
go
so
there,
popular?
David.
You
I
knew
knew
I was
you were
going to go
going
there.
I want to jump in here. I mean, yes, I'll continue with that thread later, but I think one appropriation that is really ridiculous is when people appropriate the sufferings of their ancestors as if they went through it themselves. And I think that is a really absurd appropriation. But yes, cultural appropriation, go ahead.
Yeah, that
Well,
by the way,
actually,
is an interesting thing as well. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say not just cultural appropriation of your own ancestors' sufferings, but how about other ancestors' sufferings? We see that happening too. And so we have this race, this competition for how we can really consider ourselves to be the biggest, most culturally appropriating sufferer. And so it used to be that you will say that, well, that is a little bit insufferable, but people don't understand what that means right now. And we've got to go back and say that we have to think positively in trying to fix some of the problems. Granted, we have problems in this community, in this whole world, which we're always trying to advance from. We want to go forward. And to go forward, you cannot keep on harping on some of the things that are in the past. You have to go forward. I'm looking at this right now and saying that Jennifer and I, we're two women sitting over here, and just 100 years ago, women did not have the right to vote. Are we going to harp on that for the rest of humanity? I do not think that is a very good thing. We should use that right that we have now for the betterment of the world.
I mean, here's a question though for you. It's changing the topic a little. Well, David, did you get enough of the cultural appropriation? Did you get your answers?
I did not get my fill.
You did not get your fill?
I did not get my fill, but you go ahead.
No. Let's go on that thread. Mine is kind of changing gears. So
yeah,
carry on.
Okay. So, I mean, you're all familiar with this idea of cultural appropriation. It seems to me that in some cases it can be a legitimate concern. In other words, I don't necessarily think walking around in blackface is a respectful thing to do. And I think it's okay to critique that practice. I'm sure there's incidents or examples of it that were not meant to be demeaning, but there's probably a lot more that were specifically demeaning. I'm sure that one could come up with a way in which appropriating a Chinese cultural practice could be looked at as disrespectful and demeaning to the people. And other examples where you might think, if you want to look at it that way, is it's sort of a kind of flattery. How do you think about it?
I think you've hit it right there, that sometimes it's an insult and sometimes it's flattery. And so if everybody is using chopsticks, we don't say, oh, you're not allowed to use chopsticks because you're not Asian. That's ridiculous. If people want to use it, we think that that's great. And if you like Chinese food, you like Japanese food, you like Korean food or Thai food or Filipino food, and Indian food, there's so many different provinces there too. Even Chinese food, I should say. What is wrong with that? But if you want to say that I'm going to use it and put chopsticks in my hair, I think that that's a little bit too far. That would be sort of weird and concerning, so to say. So you have to use a little judgment, but I think that goes with nearly anything. This is sort of the moment in My Cousin Vinny when the lawyer walks in wearing this cowboy suit and the judge says, "Are you mocking me?" And so you have to think about it and put it in context. Are you mocking somebody, or are you just saying, I really like it? And there are people from the Northeast who like to wear cowboy hats, okay? And I'm not going to deny them of that privilege if that pleasure, if it is not done in a mocking manner.
Just for the record, as someone who's married to a Chinese woman and has gotten better at chopsticks, I will say I've gotten better at chopsticks. Whenever there's something that my wife does not feel that I should be using a chopstick for, she will actually order the spoon from the kitchen. So it's not an act of mockery or cultural appropriation when I use chopsticks. I will say that. Okay, go ahead.
I also think it's to focus on small things like this. It's a reflection of going back to that Shaolin. The smallness of mind. We have so many bigger things to worry about. Why pick on such small? Why nurse such small injuries, and make a living out of it?
You guys will be happy to know here in America, I was married in a cheap house. So there, I was very. I took cultural appropriation all the way to my marriage.
And I think that's wonderful. If you think about it, that this notion of people wearing white wedding gowns throughout the world now, that did not start, in say Japan or China, but they're doing it there, and it's okay. We're wearing blue jeans around the world. And that's okay. And we have to say that that's part of the exchange between different cultures. We're talking about the lowest levels, obviously. When we're talking about the higher aspects of philosophy, of what we believe are the basic principles of what it means to be actually civilized. What is a enlightened civilization and society and governance? That goes above just I like this food versus not. That's a very low order. But I think that is reflective. If we cannot be, if we are not able to be open-minded and a big person in trying to be expansive and inclusive, you're not going to be able to deal with the bigger issues, the more important issues that bind us all in humanity.
Yeah. And then I also think this is something that Greg Thomas was saying. I mean, so much of the art that we create, I mean, that's a gift to the world. It's meant to be shared. So by keeping it to ourselves, I mean, we're not expanding the scope of humanity in a way. So I've got a question.
I mean, it's interesting that classical music is really big in China. and of course, if you look at the best performers in classical music, a lot of them are Jewish or Chinese. And, Michel Wang playing Rachmaninoff. Why not?
Yeah.
What's wrong with that?
Well, actually, before I ask this question, let me ask both of you, George and Wei Hua. So the Chinese American Citizens Alliance of Greater New York, it was founded in 2018. Am I correct?
No. Let's go backwards a little bit. The Chinese American Citizens Alliance, the national organization, was actually founded in 1895, and so it's a very, very old organization, the oldest civil rights organization actually for civil rights. So there are many other associations that might be for Chinese or Asians, and it was founded actually right in response to the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the Chinese Exclusion Act was the only time that America had laws that were taking away certain civil rights from a group based on ethnicity. So based on ethnicity, they actually carved away a lot of rights. So that was not repealed actually until World War II. And it took that many years for that to happen. But the Chinese American Citizens Alliance was founded then. We in the Chinese American Citizens Alliance of Greater New York, we were founded in 2016, at the end of 2016. And we have focused on issues that we think are particularly compelling, starting with education. That we think is a major issue. And that has, we looked at education and said, why is this happening? And that's how we got into other areas like critical race theory. Why have we taken such a strong stand against it? Because this kind of racial essentialism is tearing our people apart. And that's really trying to determine whether a kid should be able to get ahead or not based on his own ability, but based on what this externality that they cannot do anything about. If a person cannot do anything about something, they should not be punished for it or rewarded for it. You shouldn't be rewarded for something that you didn't earn, really, in that way. To judge for the schools, to take a test. We started off with this specialized high schools test. It's a background blind, race blind, gender blind, economics blind test. You have to just do the academics right. And so we're talking about schools. We're talking about STEM schools. So an academic test makes sense. So that's how we started on that, because it is a core issue that deals with discrimination. And we're trying to address discrimination on many points. That's how we got into the critical race theory and critical theory in general, because it's not just race, but in a number of different areas. And then also, that relates to, as we mentioned before, the attacks against Asians. There are lots of things that are related. Why have we also fought the community-based jail, what they call the community-based jail in Chinatown? It's the same kind of thing that they do in trying to say, oh, this is a group that's easy to pick on. Let's throw them in another jail. Barring the notion that they already have 4 jails in the community. It's not like a NIMBY situation. We have the jails there already. But it's just that they figure that it's easy to go and oppress this community, because they have not been as politically active in the past.
So that's, I'm sorry, I want to make sure I understood you. So that's a recent phenomenon. That's a recent development with a jail.
The jail, yes, correct.
Really?
Mm. Yes, they have plans to build a mega jail right off Canal Street, right next to a senior center for mostly Asian Chinese elders. And so when you think about what that can do to their lives and to the community, it's a horrible thing. It started off as a 40-story jail. There's nothing like that in the world. There are all sorts of issues about it just on the actual concept. Conceptually, it doesn't even make sense. But to put it also in the heart of a community, it does not serve the community. It is actually going to damage the community substantially. And if we talk about the shadow it will cast on the park, and then the dust and the noise right next to the elders, right in the senior homes, trying to get some nice final days of their lives, I think it's a horrible thing. So we have fought against that as well.
So I've been, with the whole education thing in New York, I mean, basically the public school system is broken to begin with. I think that there's a lot wrong there, and that's a whole another issue. And I understand the idea of wanting to give the best education to a wide number of people, but I don't believe that taking away the gifted programs takes you towards that aim. I think that there needs to be a complete overhaul of public school systems. And you mentioned something earlier about extracurriculars, and what role, if any, for someone who maybe does not have the means, the finances but has the will, but not the finances to get their children into the programs that would help them to succeed, scholastically. What role should our state or government play, if any, in providing those additional resources?
I'm going to answer in 2 parts. One is that I think that, of course, the government can say that we're going to try to improve education for all districts. So every place, the kids are going to be focusing more on education to start. So instead of saying that we're going to have math appreciation or history appreciation and psychological abuse or this social emotional learning that they're trying to put in, that is not really going to serve the best part, but the worst part of those things. These terms all sound great, and at the best they will do some good. At the worst, they will be incredibly harmful. But beyond what the government, the public school system can do, they should be looking at also some other alternatives. And the charter schools are one of them. And if you think about charter schools, some of the publicly funded schools, the best performing ones, happen to be charter schools. Mm-hmm. And they happen to be highly, highly Black and Hispanic demographics. So that's the one thing. You know, we shouldn't look at, oh, we have to have a certain mix. I think we should have excellence. And these kids of all races want to have the opportunity to have good schools wherever they live. You know, it doesn't have to be a certain place, and they don't need to. I think it's insulting to say that a minority kid cannot perform well unless they happen to be sitting next to a white kid. That's not true. I think that if you look at the history of schools in many countries, in fact, you're going to find them of perhaps just one race, and that's okay. You don't have to have it, and that's the most important thing, is to have the great schools. And then that goes back to what we were saying before of having the colleges. When people from all over the world come over here, they seek it because there's excellence here. They don't seek it because they can check that box of being 1% of whatever demographic that they're trying to represent. No, they're looking for excellence. Now, the other side of it is saying, what do you do if you don't have resources? I will remind people that there is something called public libraries. Okay, and people should use them. We have resources that now that the internet is widely available, you also have resources there. But I'll go back to the humble library. You actually do have a lot of the resources there for taking, for example, the specialized high school test, the SHSAT. Every year, they have books this thick, that they give for free to any kid who wants to pick it up, that will have a number of actual tests. They will have practice questions. They will discuss what you need to know. It's all available for free. And not only can you take those home and keep them forever and scratch them up, you can also borrow additional books that are there for anybody who would want it. You can actually prepare for any of these tests. And so we should encourage people to use these. Now, I'll mention this, that in one case, I was talking to a reporter who didn't like the test, obviously. And she was talking about, well, you know, everybody has to go and take these expensive courses. And I said, that's not true. You could go to the library and you could get all of these materials. I certainly know a lot of people who never took one of those courses and who did pass based on either just buying a book and doing the tests themselves, or they would go and borrow them. And you know what the reporter responded to me? He said, well, you know about libraries. That's privilege. And I just was astounded. I could not answer to, because if you are in 8th grade and you do not know what a library is, a public library in New York City, then maybe you're not quite the right student for going into a specialized high school. I'm not saying that you shouldn't get the best schooling, the best education for your abilities and interest and commitment, but maybe the specialized high schools is not for somebody who does not know what a public library is. So that's where I'm talking a little bit about what the country, not the government can do, but also what an individual can do. I think we can, from both sides, try to address this lack or deficient education that you are getting in the public schools.
Mm-hmm. I also think that education being a public good, although I think we need to really scrutinize that, because what passes for education is no longer education. But let's say education is a public good. The funding should follow the student, not the school.
That's a good point. I mean, I just, right now, there's a case up here in Texas, a suburb up north, where they're raising taxes because so many kids have left the school. And it's like the solution would be if the money followed the kid. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah.
There are institutions that do that. You know, you could see massive defunding of certain schools very quickly. It would be a very disruptive plan for sure. Maybe it needs to be disrupted in that way. But look, I have to say though that if we're talking about schools that are becoming highly ideological, the private schools and charter schools have not been any better, and maybe have been even worse than a lot of the public schools when it comes to imposing ideological agendas. And we have to at least consider that. I mean, of course, it would allow us, those of us who believe that there needed to be new schools to exist, it would allow us to do that more easily. But I do think that that's a challenge. Is that that the schools, private schools, even charter schools, have to be accredited. And I've spent a lot of time looking into the accreditation institutions, and they are much less transparent than a school board is. We can have our complaints about how school boards do things under wraps and aren't transparent about what the curriculum is or what the training programs that they're putting teachers through. And that's all true, and we should demand more transparency. You want to know what's not transparent is how a private school accrediting institution works and how it uses to impose, specific ideological requirements on these schools. So we have to be careful what we wish for.
Yeah. Yeah. Aaron Siberium mentioned that. I mean, that was shocking what he, what he unveiled for me in terms of the private school accreditation.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think it's a great development that this new college, the University of Texas
in Austin. I know.
Yes. Oh, that's where you are.
That's where I am. See my Longhorns behind me. Yes.
Yes. So because if there's a good destination, then who cares if the kid went to an accredited high school or not?
On that note, let me go back to something that I started with. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I kind of just told you my position instead of asking about it. So do you also see, George and Weiwa, this fizzling, if you will, of interest in coming over to the United States particularly for higher education from across the world? I mean, I'm not crazy, right?
You are not.
I think you're right. You're absolutely right. The opportunities in other parts of the world have increased, and the schools are focusing on basic education and research. And if we're going to spend all our time in struggle sessions, youth struggle sessions over here in America, that detracts. We've seen it happen in other countries where they put the politics and the ideology in front of what basic education is, and your science will lag, your creativity and your advances will lag, your economy will suffer, and those are the things that you expect to happen. And so we have to look at it and say that we want to stop that earlier as opposed to later. It's true that history has its cycles. This is a part that, you may be in the wrong side, part of it, but you have to try to get it back on track as soon as possible.
Yeah, we'll see how this, I'm looking forward to seeing how this university here in Austin, I think they're calling it the University of Austin, aren't they? I think that's, yeah.
UATX.
Yeah, but you know what? Austin's a weird place. So I really want to know why they picked Austin, but that's a different discussion.
I'm not convinced that we can't recuperate certain universities and instill an ethic of freedom of expression. I'm in conversation with a trustee and a philanthropist of a specific university who is trying to get the university to switch gears, and he's had some success by asking some questions. And you can do an assessment of the university's culture, both the faculty and students, and set benchmarks. You can look at the Chicago letter that laid down the law for the University of Chicago on freedom of expression and trigger warnings and safe spaces and the rest. You can set up certain institutions within the university that value free speech and have a lecture series and the like. And and it may just be that certain universities looking around saying, we're going to position ourselves that way in this environment because we know that there are some people who want their kids, and some kids will want to go to a university that are genuinely committed to the humanities and not, a specific ideology, that want to teach their kids how to think and not what to think. So I'm just wondering if institutions like the University of Austin, maybe you have some thoughts on this, are throwing the towel too soon. Like that we've come to the conclusion that these institutions are so far gone that we can't save them. And I'm not there yet personally that these institutions can't be saved, or some of them can't be saved. And it's an easier route.
I think that having a viable competitor creates good incentives.
Yeah.
I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, in other words, if you get the University of Austin up and running and it's starting to attract students, that's going to force some other schools to say, okay, maybe we ought to use that model. It's a proof of concept in a way too.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And also the faculty, the professors know that there's a place they can go to. That also creates some pressure within the department. So yes, I don't think you need too many of the University of Austin's to cause a change, but I think having none makes the battle much harder.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah. So you represent a slice of the Chinese American community. You don't claim, I know because I've talked to you both, that you're sort of representing the overwhelming majority sensibility. I could say the same about myself and my organization, that I think while there's a lot of people who secretly agree with me, that I'm still representing a minority of people who are willing at least to come out publicly and agree with me. And where do you see your role in fostering change within your own community?
I think the very first thing is to step up and say the things that people don't speak. It's sort of like saying the emperor has no clothes on. You know, somebody has to say these things. And if nobody says it, then later people will just cover it up, sweep it under the rug, and go on. We have to say that it is discrimination when you attack kids because of their race. When people, not just kids, but people for their race. And then we have to deal with the bigger issues that we don't want to tax on any people, regardless of race. That's the general crime issue. And we want everybody to be able to have a better education. We don't want anybody to be excluded from having a good education based on their race, but we do want everybody to have an opportunity to have a better one. So this is the equal rights part, as opposed to trying to say, oh, we're going to go for equal outcomes. You know, we have to understand that we're trying to give that kind of equal rights to everybody to have this kind of opportunity. It does not guarantee that everybody's going to come out at the same place, but I think that we want to make sure that nobody's rights are taken away. So we want to go and first tell people about some of these issues. We want to stand up for a lot of these problems that are happening in the community. And then in cases where we need to, we might have some lawsuits, and we do have a couple of lawsuits against the city of New York and the Department of Education for its discrimination. So we would like more people to think about how their kids are being affected and be able to step up. And you see that happening throughout the country now. You know, more parents are saying that we have some problems in what's happening to our schools, to our children, and they're speaking up. We want to encourage that kind of movement everywhere. What happened in Loudoun should be happening everywhere. When we demand for transparency and say that, yes, we have a right as individuals, as parents, as members of some distinct group. It could be Asian or Jewish, or it could be Irish Catholic versus Italian Catholic, or a Dominican Hispanic versus your Peruvian Hispanic. I think that we could go and slice and dice it too much, but I think we should stay very clear on the unifying principles, which can lead us together more.
Yeah, I think that, you know, the fight that we have in the Chinese community is for meritocracy and for an expansiveness of mind that embraces, with a certain openness, other cultures and other civilizations. But I think that the bigger fight is for those principles, meritocracy, and that is not necessarily a Chinese fight. It just happens that in this current situation, the Chinese are in the best position to step up. Stuyvesant used to be 90% Jewish, and Brooklyn Tech, the largest special high school, used to be more than half Black and Hispanic for 20 years, and now the fastest growing ethnicity at Stuyvesant is Bangladeshi, the South Asian. I think that we're all in the same fight. It just happened that the Chinese are thrust in the position where they need to step up. I mean, if the Bangladeshis one day are attacked and they have to defend meritocracy, obviously we will support them, but they're in the best position to step up. So in a way, I don't think that all Chinese Americans or any ethnicity will step up for the fight for meritocracy and enlightenment values. But I think we can cut across to reach out to other groups and find people of a similar spirit who will join the fight.
Let me ask you a question. I know we're running out of time here, but one more. We've all read about tiger moms, and like every stereotype, it's partially true, I would say, and partially untrue. That there's a reason why there's stereotypes become stereotypes. They have some reflection sometimes in who we are. I note that Coleman Hughes had a podcast with Brett Weinstein, and he was talking about his growing up, and he had a Chinese friend and a Jewish friend, I believe. And when he would go to dinner at the Chinese friend, he saw the mom who was like the fierce tiger mom pushing homework in a way that his parents never did. And he went with the Jewish family, and he saw the arguments over the dinner table that they had, and I think he learned something from both, that there's certain cultural attributes that probably in different ways were responsible for these sort of collective traits that we see in these communities. And yet, just like every individual trait can be a asset or a liability, I think cultural traits can also be an asset or liability. So one can easily say about like the tiger mom archetype, that can be really rough on mental health for kids. It might work to get kids to practice the piano for 3 hours a day, or to get A's in math when they might have gotten B's otherwise. But it is also pretty tough on a kid, and you see a lot of this sort of these mental health manifestations among Asian American kids. Is that something that gives you pause in the whole meritocracy ideal?
I have very strong feelings on this, so I'm going to jump in and
Okay.
can correct my. I have very strong feelings about this because I have heard that said. I've heard that said, and especially when people want to talk about the model minority, saying that the model minority myth is causing mass suicide among Asian Americans.
That's exaggerated.
And the way I address that is, most of the Chinese Americans are, many of them, especially in New York City, are not rich. Okay, they don't live in the best neighborhoods. So they come home, they can study, or they can go on the streets. Which is better? Sure, there are a couple of suicides a year among the Chinese Americans, but in terms of overall deaths, gang deaths, drug overdose deaths, bullying deaths, internet, online bullying, suicides, dietary, health disorder from eating deaths. If you put all that together, the Chinese American suicide or death rate is very, very small. I forgot to mention binge drinking deaths and drug overdose deaths. Did I mention that already? And car accidents from drunken driving deaths. Yes, you can study. Or if you're not studying, you can get in trouble. You really can, given the social context in which many of these families live. Okay? And I think that studying is I'll prefer overall if you have to give me the two packages, I'll take the studying.
Are they really just two packages? In other words,
there are many other packages, but I think that the majority culture package is exactly that, especially in communities that are contiguous to the Chinese communities in New York City. it's not that far from the Chinese communities where a lot of people in the Black community end up in jail by the time they're 30, at least once, or arrested. There's given this kind of climate, I think, keep them home or keep them in a
Right.
study
Right.
school
The,
and keep them out of trouble.
It seems to me that the New York example is an interesting one, and it's obviously it's a very large place, New York. But I live, for example, in Montgomery County, Maryland. Right, it has got one of the highest average achievement rates of any school district in the United States. The high school that my stepkids go is probably, I think, about 40% Asian American, overwhelmingly Chinese American. A lot of Jewish kids go there. It is, I think, the third highest average test score high school in the state of Maryland. Now, and by the way, the first highest is another school that's almost exactly like it, about 5 miles away. I'm familiar with this, but this is a suburban model now, right? And the option, the kid who doesn't study hard is not necessarily opting for gang violence. So I understand that when close proximity in inner city areas and poor areas, especially, that might be the alternative package. But in a place like Montgomery County, it's not necessarily the case. So I do think the dynamic changes a little there. And I agree, by the way, that I'm sure you're right about the percentages and the number of suicides. I'm sure that's correct, but it doesn't mean that that's ultimately the optimal cultural paradigm for the community, does it? I mean, you could still say, well, maybe we should soften a little bit on the Tiger Mom accelerator.
Okay, I'm gonna jump in a little over here. I think that there are things that are excessive. Parents should know what a kid is able to do and achieve, and not ask somebody who is able to jump 5 feet to jump 20 feet. It's not normal. You don't do that as a regular parent. Now, on the margins of it, you have to say, why is it that the Asians will say that you should study harder? Part of it is that we do believe that studying is good, okay? And setting that aside, when you know that the numbers are against you, when you know that the kids are going to be barred from the schools because of their race, then you have to achieve even higher and work even harder. So what is a parent to do? Does a parent say, work harder? Or does a parent say, give up, you have no hope? I think it is better to tell them that you do have some hope. It may be hard for you. It will be harder because of what you happen to be, not by what you've done, but because of the unfortunate dynamics that we have that will not judge you by your own personal individual merits, but by your group identity. Yes, you will have to work harder, but that sure beats telling them there's no hope for you, kid.
I agree with that. Well, it's a
so
fascinating
if you want
conversation.
To talk about that, yeah.
Yeah.
We're gonna have to bring it. Was it Amy Chu? Isn't she the one who wrote the book?
Amy Chua, yeah.
Chua, yeah. I'm sorry if I pronounced it.
I have her book, by the way, her book review in front of me on Amazon, talking about the triple threat. I looked it up, and about similarity between Chinese and Jewish cultural attributes. Very similar.
Right. She's actually married to a Jewish man, by the way.
She is.
It is right. It is a little different. And look, the truth is that most Jews are in third or fourth generation households, right? So the American Jew of today, which is not necessarily being raised the same way that their parents or grandparents were raised, because they've been more established on the American scene. So it's not always a very fair comparison in a way.
What you describe actually is more of an immigrant phenomenon, because the Jamaican mom or the Nigerian mom is not any easier than the Chinese mom.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that goes back to what we said at the beginning, because I think you do see that stereotype in a lot of immigrant families. If you're going to put a stereotype on it, I don't think it's due to race, but maybe that experience of the immigration experience.
Right. Especially when there is discrimination too.
Yeah.
On top of that.
Right. Well, this has been fascinating, and I hope we can continue the conversation.
Yeah, we'll let you get on with your evening.
I know we will.
Yeah,
Thank you.
We thank you for this opportunity. I think that these are very interesting times that we're in. And so I think that we need more than ever to be thinking together, to have an open exchange, to have the transparency that we want in our schoolrooms as well as on our boardrooms and on our streets.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And
Thanks a million.
latkes are mine.
And
Not
so-
hamantaschen, but latkes.
I'll take the hamantaschen.
Right. One last, my wife and I one time went to the Lower East Side / Chinatown in New York, and we did a comparison of Chinese cuisine and Jewish, traditional Ashkenazic foods like the knish and so forth. And according to her, the Chinese food won hands down. So anyway,
And she's unbiased, of course.
she's unbiased.
But I think that this is one of the wonderful things about New York or about America. You can get bagels anywhere now in the country, just as you can get some good, reasonable fried rice all across the country too. That's what it's all about.
That's what it's all. The
Amen.
democratization of our food.
Amen.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say Hold My Drink and the conversation gets real.